Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Beyond the Headlines. Our guest today, back for another session about World War I, is Brian McCall. Brian is an adjunct professor at Northwestern Michigan College and Forest State University, and an instructor in history at the Interlochen Arts Academy. He has a BA in history from Central Michigan University and a master's degree in British history from Strathclyde University in Scotland. The year that we're going to return to, for those of you who saw our first hour about World War I, we're returning to 1914, and the war has begun. Germany has declared war against France and Belgium. Austria-Hungary has declared war against Russia and Serbia. And in the Eastern Front, the Battle of Tannenberg has resulted in a German triumph over a superior Russian force. Brian McCall, welcome back to Beyond the Headlines.
Thanks, Jack. Good to be back.
Thank you. Now, let's start with the Battle of Tannenberg.
Right.
The Eastern Front went quiet, relatively speaking, after this battle. So what was the accomplishment that the Germans achieved there?
Well, one of the things that when we had our last program, we talked about the different makeup of all these different armies and the countries that produced them. And the one big assumption on the part of the Germans in their Schlieffen Plan, or the variations on that, was that the Russian army, even though it was huge, by its very nature being so big, and the fact that Russia was, of all the big great powers, the most disorganized, that it would take a long time for a Russian army to really mobilize, get their soldiers moving, armed, on trains, and moving up to the front. That's the key thing. They assumed it would take 6 weeks for a Russian army to really start to move out of Russia and get close to what it now is Western Poland, but at that point was East Prussia or other German holdings in Silesia. That's the plan.
It's an integral part of Germany.
That's right. It's German homeland.
World War period. Yeah.
And so the goal was that this 6 weeks would be long enough for the German army to smash into France, through Belgium, come around the backside of Paris, not into Paris, but around the outside of it on the west, and knock out the French and the British, actually, if they could, in the process, at least their field army. By the time that all happened, they could throw the men back on the trains all the way across Germany and meet the Russians. So the German soldiers in the Eastern Front, there's only about 10 to 15% of the German army left in Germany on the east to face the Russians when war goes live on August 4th. Those German soldiers were commanded by two people that probably some of your viewers have at least heard of. One, because of the airship that was named after him, Hindenburg, and the other one, Ludendorff, who these two generals or field marshals are going to end up being players in post-war Germany too. Mm-hmm. They decided to use their second front status to their advantage as commanders, because they were given this big, huge job of keeping the Russians out while holding on to that front long enough for the big main German force to come back. And they do this by basically getting the Russians to follow into an area of East Prussia that once they do, it would be very, very difficult for the Russians to both work their armies together and to fight against the Germans effectively, even though they were bigger and more, they outnumbered the Germans at 1.3 to 1. Tactically, on the field where they pick, which is this Tannenberg forest, it's very, very difficult for the two big main Russian armies to move into each other. One big thing that the Germans had in their favor, they didn't know it, the two Russian commanders hated each other.
They hated each other.
They hated each other, and they absolutely don't communicate with each other and don't trust each other.
And the two German commanders are from that region.
They're from that region, and they work hand in glove. Mm-hmm. So this is one of these episodes where you have the four principal people in charge probably had more effect than any other main soldiers. The German soldiers and the Russian soldiers at this battle all fight very bravely. The Russian soldiers, unfortunately for them, had these incredibly incompetent leadership at the top, and it also filters down to their rank and field officers as well. Russian officers in 1914 were, a lot of them had gotten their commissions because of family connections. Some of them knew their business, many did not. And when you go into combat, common soldiers can probably figure out who the really competent officers are pretty quickly, and that's what happened to these Russians. A lot of them realized that their officers were incompetent.
And that plays out a little later. We'll come
Right.
back to that. But now in the U.S., President Woodrow Wilson is saying the United States is going to remain neutral.
Right.
And tension shifts to the Western Front.
Right.
The first battle of the Marne begins, and this is the beginning of a race to see who can outflank each other.
Right.
Tell me a
Marne
little
is
bit about that.
Marne is the most. It's the greatest in terms of size battle that had probably ever taken place on the European continent, and that is saying something if you know a little
Yes,
European
indeed.
history. And what had happened was that the Germans, when they had launched their plan, and they marched 30 miles a day through Belgium, they passed through Belgium, they push most of the British army aside after two big fights in eastern and western Belgium, a town called Mons, and at, what's the other one called? Grand Calais or something like that. They're through Belgium with the British on their eastern side, or western side.
Western side. Oh, no,
And
in other words, pushed in against the sea.
a little bit. And as they came down, the original plan was that this German army, this far right wing, would come all the way around Paris. They wouldn't go into Paris because Paris is huge and it's a fortified city. So they weren't going to try to smash into it. They were going to go around it, in effect make the French react to them. And initially they did, but the French commander and the Allied commander of all of these forces in 1914, General Joffre, he decides pretty quickly, once he realizes what was happening, it took him a while, that the smart thing to do was to retreat and find a spot where they could turn and wait for an opening. And that's what happened at the Marne. The Marne, if you don't know the topography of France, is a river. It kind of runs dead east-west to the east of Paris. So if you drive out of Paris, you can drive alongside of it. It's pretty countryside.
So he's giving up ground, but he's going to stop them at the Marne.
He's waiting for them to get to that river.
Does trench warfare begin at this point?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. And this is one of the things that we were going to talk about why World War I was such a catastrophe, is that in these first few weeks of the war, in August and September, the reality of what it means to stand up and trade fire with people who have equal weapons in terms of technology and accuracy and power was, for any of the soldiers who survived it, that was an unforgettable experience, I'm sure.
So there's been a technological change.
Huge technological change.
Tell us a little bit, what were the weapons that suddenly appeared on the battlefield that changed the equation?
Yeah, a lot of our viewers are going to remember or have images of the Civil War. And we just had the movie Lincoln out. There's some pretty graphic scenes about what battlefields look like in the Civil War and the weapons that were used. And the other thing about the Civil War, the American Civil War, it's often called the first modern war because of the scale of organization and some of the level of weaponry that was used. But there's one big difference between the weapons of 1860 and the weapons of 1914. And if you're going to wrap it up into one thing, it would be the cartridge and smokeless powder. And I brought with me, if I have it with me, yes, an example of what I'm talking about. This is a pretty large one, but that's everyone who's ever seen a modern gun will recognize what this is, although this is a pretty large version of this, a 50 caliber heavy machine gun bullet.
So that is a bullet. This is the head of the bullet.
Right.
It's going to come at you if you're on the field here.
Right. And one of the things about this particular technological innovation is that cartridge weapons had been invented right around the time of the Civil War. Colt pistols go to cartridges right around the Civil War time. Henry repeating rifles use a cartridge. So you have this brass area with the gunpowder in it, either a rimfire igniter or more commonly on modern ones, centerfire, and then a steel jacketed or a lead bullet on the inside. Now, what's in here is what matters. If it's black powder, you're going to get a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, and relatively low muzzle velocity, which means that a bullet fired this size with a black powder cartridge is going to go a long way, and it may even fly fairly accurately, but it won't fly anywhere as far or as fast as if you use modern smokeless powder. And this starts to come on at about the turn of the century. So our viewers that deer hunt, anyone would recognize this type of cartridge because deer rifles today, every rifle today, basically uses the same technological revolution that happened about 110 years ago with this.
Presumably they're not using anything that heavy against deer, though.
No, 50 caliber is pretty big. But the huge change was that battlefield tactics of the teens, the 1914, hadn't caught up with the power of these weapons.
I see.
They had been using them, but really one of the key things to remember about the armies of 1914, especially the professional ones, the British are a good example, they had spent 30 years using this type of shell or this type of cartridge in their weapons, but they shot them all at colonial wars, not against other European armies. One exception you could call the Boer War, a precursor to what's going to happen, the Boer War of 1899
So
to
one side
2000.
has these modern weapons,
The other
but
side
the other side
doesn't.
didn't for the most part.
Or if they didn't know how to use them.
Now it's changed. The World War I picture is both sides have.
Both sides have this.
So they have machine guns.
Machine guns fire, all of them would have been smaller than this
Uh-huh.
cartridge, but the principle's the same.
Yeah.
You can lay accurate fire with a weapon like this that shoots a pistol, shoots a round like this, at effective ranges of nearly half a mile. That is a long way.
Yeah.
If you can have an open sight line, you're in like a rolling or on the edge of a hill, at the top of a hill, you can kill men at a half a mile away. They won't even hear what hit them. This is new. And neither side, no one really knew what would happen when all of these were going to be unleashed at each other. That's the huge thing that changed. The Marne is the first time where you have two big armies, the French army, the British army, versus this German army, all standing up, very little field fortification, open field battle, firing these at each other.
So this is a slaughter. There were
It
hundreds
is
of thousands of
unbelievable
people.
slaughter. It's 250,000 dead within about a 2-day battle.
That's incredible. A quarter of a million people killed
The
in 2 days.
numbers of losses that the French had in the first 5 months of World War I are so great they don't publish them. They don't tell anyone. It's 1 million people. 1 million Frenchmen die in 3 months. And the families found out individually, but this was top secret. The only people that really could tell you what had happened were those that survived at the end of it. They'd never seen anything like it. No one had ever seen anything like that.
Now this is just a beginning of more to come.
Yeah.
They move on to a place called Ypres.
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 Yeah.
Y-P-R-E-S.
Right.
Okay, well this is where and what are they trying to do
After
here?
Marne, the Germans retreat.
They retreated.
They retreat, and they didn't really have a plan for retreat. This is not what they had intended. They didn't have Plan B after Schlieffen failed.
So their hope of encircling Paris is now off the table.
That's right. And their goal at this point is to find a spot where they can fall back, then come back over again and outflank the British and Allies and in effect restart Schlieffen, restart this idea. And so both sides push each other north, looking for the gap where they can come back over the top, either the Germans going towards the west or the British and the French turning toward the east. And again, anyone who lived through this first couple of months of World War I will never forget, this is not a war of trenches, it's a war of marching and constant fighting all this time, with the casualties as a result from
contact
this.
with each other, they're having big skirmishes.
Big. Big skirmishes today that would, in 1914, that would have looked like major battles in a Civil War battlefield. They're very big armies fighting each other. And they're exhausted, absolutely exhausted, both sides. Both sides marched for probably 2 months, 30 miles a day. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that when I'm 18, I don't think. And they have millions of men on the march fighting each other until they get up to Ypres. And Ypres, if you've never been there, we've talked about this. Did you get to go there when you were living there? Yeah. You kind of remember what it looks like. It's flat. That whole area, when that Flanders countryside that goes up to the ocean, there's very little anything noticeable about it topographically. The water level's very high. So you stick a spade into the mud and you're going to hit water probably within about 2 to 3 feet. So trenches are just ditches, basically. Both sides don't want to fight there, but they have to fight there. It's an encounter battle again. And when they end up fighting there, both sides also realize, the British realize and the French realize they absolutely have to hold this position. The Germans realize that if they don't turn, the British and the French at Ypres, that they're going to be locked into a stalemate, which is exactly what happened. And they are both relentless in fighting up there. Both sides don't give up. And on the British side, they throw in the cooks, they throw in the orderlies, they in effect put a pistol in the back of the conscientious objectors who were stretcher bearers and make them pick up a rifle. Wow. The Germans, on the other hand, threw in, I think we mentioned this last time, every university and high school senior in Germany who was going to go off to university, basically the cream of the crop of Germany's educational system, they're all thrown in and killed within about 2 months.
So this is becoming a total war in the true sense of the word.
Yeah.
Now, with the stalemate now developed on the Western Front, there is a little lull around Christmas time. There was a wonderful movie made about that.
Yeah.
And then back in the following year, in 1915, the start of the war shifts really to the Dardanelles.
Right.
What were the British and the Australians trying to accomplish in the Dardanelles?
This is a germ of an idea that comes out of the brain of Winston Churchill. Oh. And it's actually, Churchill as a character, if you know his life story, had been a pretty, a very, very, I wouldn't call him popular, but a famous man at the point of the Boer War. He had been a newspaper correspondent, he ends up being a spy, fights in there, and made his way into British politics. By the time World War I starts, he's First Lord of the Admiralty. And he is always looking for something that will be unexpected, the main chance to change things, the game changer. That's him. And he focuses on this situation in the Dardanelles between the Turks and the Austrians. And the Turks aren't officially in World War I yet, but they're leaning very heavily towards the Central Powers, towards Germany and Austria, which is ironic because the Austrians and the Turks were mortal enemies for hundreds of years. But war makes strange bedfellows out of people. So he thinks that if he can force a Royal Navy squadron through the Dardanelles, which is the area between Turkey and
this narrow strait,
really narrow strait
to the Black Sea.
They can link up with the Russians, they can knock the Turks out, there'll be a revolution in Turkey, and then they could supply Russia and basically get at Austria-Hungary through the back door. This is the idea. He's relying on the fact that big new battleships, which had been online for about 10 years with the launching of the HMS Dreadnought, were seen to be, by a lot of people at the time, undefeatable. They were just invincible. Nobody could stop them. So a bunch of British battleships with good crews versus a bunch of Turks on the sides of the hills, no contest. What he didn't know, or what he wanted to ignore, was that the Turks had been trained by the Germans in how to fire shore artillery. And they had good intelligence that the British were coming. They mined the whole area. And when the British and French fleet shows up, they start hitting these mines and start getting sunk by Turkish shore batteries. So they can't do this. So the next step is, well, if we can't push our way through with the Navy, let's put some men ashore, take those guns off the sides of the hills, then go through. And the people who got the job to take the guns away were the Australians and the New Zealanders and South Africans and some British. And that's what many people have heard of the place of Gallipoli. It's one of the beaches that they land on to try to do exactly that. It's a disaster.
This is like a 9-month slugfest.
It is
just
an
a disaster.
absolute
Yeah.
disaster on all sides, really. I mean, the Turks win, if you want to call it that. Their losses were probably greater than the Australians and the New Zealanders. The Allies never really get more than a toehold. They're under shell fire and rifle fire constantly. And
they're trying to push up these hills to get to those shore guns that are up.
And every attempt to push up the hills is just beaten back eventually. It's horrible. The movie Gallipoli probably does, still to this day, one of the best jobs at showing exactly how futile this was.
Yeah, and they eventually, each time they blow the whistle, these guys have to go up over the top
hill.
of the edge of their trenches and into the withering fire coming down at them.
They went over the hill, and a lot of them are still there. Yeah. The Australian cemeteries are pretty impressive that they have in Turkey. And I have a very good friend who's Australian who's told me that most Australians see this as the moment of Australia as a separate country, no longer a colony of England. The way that the Australian and New Zealanders were, by all accounts, mishandled by their British commanders really seared the idea of maybe not complete independence. So they debate that from time to time, taking the Queen off their money and going completely on their own, but at least having independence of their own destiny. And
Which at this time they're still a colony of the British Empire.
Crown colony, in effect, yeah. I mean, the British ask them to help, and they do, but this is never to be forgotten in Australia, what happened there.
Now, another example of what you referred to earlier, the kind of industrialization, mechanization of the war, is the war at sea. The Germans have a fleet of U-boats, of submarines. Right. They're not anything like today's ultra-modern war weapons.
Still pretty effective.
But for the time, they were a game changer, you would say.
Well, you mentioned American neutrality. And the Germans immediately saw this was it's a red herring for them. American neutrality, in effect, meant that the Americans were going to be the supplier of anything that the British could get, because the only people who could sail were British ships or neutral ships. Every single German merchant ship is pretty much swept off the sea within a month. By September of 1914, there's hardly any, you can't fly a German flag without being chased down by a British cruiser or destroyer. So their overseas trade evaporates. Of course, the British are going to, they relied on this. It was their absolute lifeline, especially wheat from Canada, soldiers from Canada, and as many arms and food and equipment that they could buy from the United States. So control of the sea, on one of the questions I put on here for our discussion today was, how close did the Germans come to winning this war? This is always usually when most people think of World War I, they do think about, first of all, the war in the trenches and how well or how badly this was fought. But the war at sea really probably does decide this, because the British ability to control the sea eventually starves the Germans to the point where they no longer could feed not only their army, but their families. At one point, Germans were down to 600 calories a day. So that's a tiny amount of food.
A famous statement by a general that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics.
That's exactly right.
And this is
a perfect example
of it. Yeah.
In some scenarios that you could play out, like when we've been talking about 1914, had the Germans won the race to the sea, had the line at the Marne been broken and they had pushed through and destroyed what was left of the British army and basically neutralized the French army, had they surrounded Paris and put it under siege, had this all been over with literally like every war is always predicted to be by Christmas, then logistics probably would not have mattered. But the moment that these things happened on the battlefield in France, all of the other aspects of the war, the worldwide aspect of this war, comes into play. And this war at sea is probably the critical factor.
Now, one of the U-boats catches a big ship called the Lusitania,
yes,
and it sinks in relatively quickly.
18 minutes.
18 minutes. And
The Titanic took 4 hours?
so I have
And they're
almost
roughly the same
1,200
size.
people were killed, of whom 128 were Americans,
Within sight of Ireland.
within sight of Ireland.
Many of them washed up to shore.
Wow.
They were buried in mass graves or individual graves. Some went home.
This is a big shock in America, though.
Yeah,
right there.
when I thought about the Lusitania, I've always thought about what would happen if an equivalent thing happened to Americans today in the midst of a world war, of which it would be hard to imagine that we wouldn't be involved in a big world war.
Yeah.
But to be on the outside looking in and then have this thing happen. Now, the Germans have these very interesting ways of looking at the Lusitania story. Their one position, and it's a legitimate one, is that the Germans were fighting for their lives, as were the British, and that in the event of a existential war, you do whatever you need to do to win.
But this was an unarmed freighter, right? It was not a warship.
An unarmed passenger liner.
Passenger liner, with a cargo on board.
With what that cargo was is very important.
Yeah.
There have been some diving expeditions down to what's left of it, down off Cork. And there's probably pretty clear evidence that the hold was filled with either gunpowder, ammunition, rifles, who knows, war material of some form. And the Germans, in effect, said that the British were using the men and the women on these ships as human shields. And in an existential war, they were going to do whatever it took. And if the British and the French were going to put these people in danger, the Germans would, in effect, say, we'll show you how much danger this is.
Was there any waffling on the German side after that tragedy, though?
Yes.
They did
not want to really, probably their general staff was, I'm sure, split on, you know, the United States in 1915 was in absolutely no condition to really seriously fight a world war, even though it was a big country and huge industrial. The ramp up would take a year, which we found out in 1917 it did. But they also thought, this is not worth antagonizing to the point of, you know, why make more enemies than you absolutely have to? And so they did back off. And they quit sinking unarmed ships, or at least neutral ships. British ships, still open season if they could find them.
Now, the second half of 1915, there don't seem to be a lot of change. The war in Gallipoli is going on.
Right.
The war on the Marne is going on. The Western Front has its battles.
It's a good thing to look at the British war effort during 1915 to get a feel for how this all played out and during this time. It's an interesting year of the war because the professional army that went to war in August of 1914 was dead, wounded, or basically pulled off the line. The French army of 1914 was, like I told you, it was decimated, absolutely decimated. The Germans had huge losses, especially at the end when they went up against Ypres. So what happens is that both sides train, reload. Now what the British did was, this was the point where they load in what we would call our National Guardsmen. They called them the Territorials. The colonial soldiers, professionals from India, from Canada, from South Africa, they began to arrive in England and then go over to France. And then they're killed. And by the end of 1915, you have this incredible shortage. And there's no draft yet. They're thinking about it. In fact, they'll pass a law to make that happen. But they are spending most of 1915 trying to decide what to do once they run out of these next level of soldiers. And that's when the massive recruitment that they call it Kitchener's Army happens, where they began to recruit basically every young man that they could. And the British did something that, if you as an American veteran could never in a million years imagine. They took all their soldiers and let them enlist in groups and train in groups and to get deployed in groups. So you would go from your office to boot camp to the trenches, and you'd be with your same town, same friends, people you grew up your whole life with. They would never do this in the American Army today.
Because they'd wipe out a whole village in
It
one
would
battle.
wipe out a whole
Yeah.
village. And we found out in World War II with the famous case of the Sullivan brothers. There was 5 brothers basically allowed to serve on one ship. They were all drowned in one action off Guadalcanal. That is the end of that.
Yeah.
Where you're going to let anybody do that. And most of your viewers have seen Saving Private Ryan, same kind of scenario.
Now, they've sort of retrenched now, and they've rearmed or resupplied themselves with troops.
Right.
And we're moving into 1916 and the Battle of Verdun.
Yes.
Now this became like an incredible bloodbath. 1 million
It is.
people, 1 million casualties, just staggering numbers.
Have you been there?
I have not, no.
It is the most, the fields around the Somme and Ypres, because they're flat, and there's the cemeteries. I just read a report this morning, actually, in Record Eagle about cleaning up the cemeteries for getting ready for the anniversary.
I saw that in the paper, yeah.
Those cemeteries in the northern line of the Western Front are quite beautiful. They're laid out and they're spacious, or small, depending on where you're at. But Verdun is unique because it's hilly, and I wanted to get back to this, the number of shells that were fired into this area were such an enormous amount of shelling and so many of them never exploded, and so many bodies were never recovered, that basically what they did to the area around Verdun is they have evacuated it, and they let it, I don't know if they actively replanted, but they in effect let it go back to nature, but it's a very strange form of nature. It's the only place you'll ever go in the world where you have forests that grow like this out of the shell holes. They're the weirdest looking forest you'll ever see. Wow. And it's because the ground underneath looks like the moon. It's an incredibly sad place. There's probably upwards of 150 to 200,000 missing in Verdun. They have no idea what happened. They're dead, but what happened to their bodies, nobody knows. Wow. Verdun is an artillery battle. And we were talking about this type of technology in rifles and machine guns. Imagine I had a 75 millimeter cannon shell in my hand. And this is a new invention that the French, again, along with Germany and everybody else, basically came up with at the same time. Take smokeless powder and turn your field artillery shells, instead of having a separate shell and a separate charge, combine them together into one. You can make a field artillery piece that you can load and fire and reload in 5 to 10 seconds, depending on how good your crew is. This type of weapon, about that big, in the hands of both sides, fired at each other, or larger.
And 75 millimeter would be something like that.
That's right. These are very fast, very quick firing guns. They fire a 75 millimeter projectile at a very high velocity on a flat trajectory. And the killing power of these is incredible. They use special fuses that are designed to explode, if you're lucky, if you're in the gun crew. The goal is that they explode just above ground level and can kill 25 or 30 people with one shell. No one will never know what hit them.
So it's even above the trenches if they're in the trench.
Right.
But it'll explode over them and kill them anyway.
In the Marne and at the first months of the war, these were being used as field pieces, kind of rolled up and used in traditional ways like you would see in a Civil War movie. But by 1915, after everybody dug in, they pulled them back and embed them and use them as field artillery killed more men than anything else in World War I. And it's going to kill more men at Verdun than anything else. Shelling is constant, never goes away. It's 6 months of hell.
Now, 6 months of hell is followed by a new battle of the Somme.
Which is the most important battle in the British mentality of World War I. It's the kind of like if British people think about World War I, they usually go to July 1st at 7:30 in the morning, and they're in a trench, and they're wearing their hat, their helmet, and they're smoking their last cigarette, and then their officer's whistle goes off, and they come out over the top. That is probably the crystallizing image for most British people about World War I is what happened on that morning. And this battle is, again, an artillery battle largely. It's a battle that is set up with the goal of smashing with these guns, these bigger and bigger and bigger guns, 12-inch in some cases, a 12-inch shell, to put these on top of the Germans' positions and basically just kill everybody in the trenches, destroy the trench system, and blow a hole through about a 20-mile area of the German front, and then have the British Army walk through it, and then have the cavalry ride through it. That's the plan. So artillery first, infantry occupation, not really assault, but occupation, and then a cavalry assault afterwards to go behind the lines. That's the plan.
That's the plan, but that's always in theory. Now somebody introduces a new weapon, a tank. Where did this...
That starts at the Somme, but not on July 1st.
Okay.
Later, this battle will also go on for months. And the British tank idea had been knocked around by a couple of different people before the war. It's not too hard to think of. They had already had armored cars. They'd seen those before. So the trick is, you can't put a car in a trench-filled battlefield.
Right.
So you need something with treads. Caterpillar treads, again, another turn-of-the-century invention. Combine that with a armored shell. The number one problem, of course, if you were thinking about this, is back with engines of 100 years ago, how in the world are you going to get something that big and heavy to actually move? So the size of the engines that they put in these early tanks are just colossal. They're unbelievable. And they're actually very low power. So they're huge, but low power.
So they're slow and cumbersome. And the
temperature
treads
inside is
break all
probably
the time.
about 130 to 140 degrees inside. Full of fumes. They try to vent out the exhaust. Big crews, too. Crews of... the Germans made one at the very end of the war, had a crew of 10 in a tank. And you've been in tanks, so you know that's a big tank.
That's a big target. That's a valuable target,
yes.
too. Yeah.
So these British tanks are... and you'd have to give the British some credit. They developed this from basically drawing board to operational within about a year, and they do it secretly. How the Germans never found out, I do not know.
So it's only on the British side, and one of the values of a tank that we were always taught was the shock effect.
Okay.
That you don't expect that to be appearing in front of you, and all of a sudden there's an invulnerable
And in the areas that they used them against the Germans, it did work.
Yeah.
The trouble, of course, was they didn't have enough of them. They didn't know how to use them. It's a lot like what happens with any new technology. People assume the technology itself is enough, as opposed to how do you use it, not just in war, but in all kinds of endeavors.
So we're going to have to wait till the Battle of El Alamein before we see that thing.
Or even May 1940 in France, of really effective use of tanks.
Now we have to stay on our timeline, so let's move to 1917. I'm just passing casually over a couple million casualties.
Well, I think
at Verdun and the Somme.
I think, though, for purposes of this show, one of the things that I wanted to emphasize when we had these conversations is you're actually fine to do so in this respect. The banality and the futility is so unbelievably overwhelming during that period, 16 and 17, of having men charge out and face these things over and over and over again to no end other than carnage it's beyond criminal. And you're right in the sense that there's all these place names, and all of these people died for, at the time, I'm sure they thought, well, yes, they were fighting for their country, but to be basically ordered to certain deaths for your country with no perceivable chance of success, certainly none by 1916. Because on the first day of the Somme, exactly as what you would predict it would have happened, is that the Germans weren't all dead. Of course they weren't. And the British came out of the trenches, marched, some of them didn't get more than 50 feet. And by the end of that day, 60,000, one day, most of them killed in 20 minutes, are either dead or wounded. And of those of the 40,000 wounded, most of them died within the next 2 days because nobody could go out and get them. The fire was so intense.
And died of their wounds.
It's just horrible.
Now, I want to touch two last things in our 5 minutes we have remaining.
Great.
And that is one, the U.S. role, because
Right.
the U.S. joins the fight in April 1917. And then also, you're very, very astute and thoughtful question of what do we learn from this war?
Right.
So first about the United States, what effect did it have that we got in?
The U-boat offensive resumes. And when the German diet basically sinks to less than 1,000 calories per person, the British blockade was so effective. And Germany, because of its industrialization, had really neglected farming for, probably at least a couple generations. And the ability to feed themselves and their army was just at its breaking point. You can't have people who live in cities rely on food being brought into them, being told that they're going to watch their kids die because there's not enough food. I've read where something like hundreds of thousands of German children died during World War I of malnutrition. Were these deaths caused by the British? Well, indirectly, yes. So the Kaiser, the German military, the Army and the Navy both put pressure on the Kaiser to reverse his policy, let the U-boats go. They'd built a lot more of them in the interim and start sinking every ship that they can, and they do. And when they do, they begin to sink American flagships. And this put Wilson under enormous pressure.
He had promised to keep us out of the war.
He'd gotten reelected in 1916 on exactly that kind of campaign promise. But so he takes his second inaugural in March. By April, we're at war. And the thing about Wilson was that, and the U.S. Army at that time, is one of the great mysteries of World War I is how unprepared. This war had been going on for 3 years at that point, and it was like it was somewhere else on another planet. We had a pretty badly run punishing, I don't know what you would call it, an invasion of Mexico, for lack of a better term, that was badly managed, not very well done, owned after Pancho Villa. Some people know about this from watching Western movies. They come back from that. The Army really looked bad after this. And when April of 1917, they are in absolutely no condition to do anything. And in fact, it took a year to get the U.S. Army booted up on the ground and ready to go and actually be able to fight in France and be effective. We never had, in World War I, American tanks. We didn't use American artillery for the most part. We used French guns. We didn't have our own machine guns until the end. We didn't have our own airplanes. We flew French planes primarily. There were some American planes used in the war, DH-4s, kind of a big two-seat bomber for our Air Force, and some of the pilots nicknamed them flying coffins. So our war effort was, we learned a lot in World War I that would really take heart to World War II. But in terms of preparation, we weren't ready. There is one thing about our American involvement. In the classes I teach about this, that if you can imagine World War I as a game of Jenga, and a lot of people have played that, where you pull the blocks out until they fall over. And if you looked at it in 1914, the American block on a Jenga game would be very, very small. But if you looked at it in 1918, it would be half the board. And if you pulled it out, the Germans, would they have won? I don't know, but they wouldn't have lost, for example. Our role in 1918 is critical.
So everyone else is exhausted, basically, and run out of people, and run out of soldiers.
Average age of German soldiers in 1918 was 16. Average.
And they were deserting as well. As we never really talk about it, but the Russian army
collapsed.
Disappeared.
Just collapses. Basically goes back to Russia.
The Russian Revolution has gotten underway.
And the French and British armies were, the French army had mutinied in 1917. They refused to fight for about a month.
So this little extra nudge from even this ill-equipped American force seems to be a game changer again.
By 1918, and especially by the summer of 1918, they're Americans. They're tough. They were hard fighting. They learned quickly, and they were the difference maker in two big areas of the war on the front, at Meuse-Argonne and Château-Thierry. Those two big battles, without the Americans, the Germans would have potentially broken through. Now, whether or not they could have held it is another question. But our role was critical there.
So the Germans see that there's no way they can win this war, and they are the Kaiser Wilhelm. He abdicates, and basically Germany folds its cards and said we want peace.
This is the most terrible. I think of the last question of what can we learn from the war.
Yeah.
There's so many lessons about World War I, but they're almost all negative. What not to do. And one of the things that we probably need some more help with is when you're going to get involved in a war, you should really, really think very, very carefully and have people that you trust in charge of thinking about what is going to happen after this war. What will our role be when the fighting stops? It won't go on forever.
Pretty familiar, yeah.
That does sound pretty familiar. And our, he said, how are you going to deal with the pressure of people who are so desperate for peace that they will take anything to get their boys back home, as well they would want them to? How do you treat defeated enemies? Mm-hmm. How do you reintegrate nations into a global community? How do you take the role of the military and put it in its rightful place so it doesn't call the shots in a country's governing structure? This is the number one problem that happened in what we talked about in 1914 is that the moment that it looked like diplomacy was going to break down, the generals walk into the rooms of every ministry in all of Europe and say, "Thank you, we'll take over now." And they basically said, You've told us what to do to save the country, and now we're going to do it. And you really can't stop any of what we are going to do. And everything we do now will be for national defense purposes. That's crazy.
I think we're gonna need another segment to talk about the international elements of this war and what it led to after the war,
right.
Which is a whole very tragic story.
It is good. My last question, I said, is it worth studying carefully or are we remembering because it's 100 years old? The 100-year-old part of this war coming up, I think is going to serve a really good purpose. And also the fact that there are no living participants left, which means that you can talk about it in a little more of an objective way than you could have when people who are still alive who participated in it are around to hear what we talk about it.
Well, that's a great way to close. Brian McCall has been our guest today on Beyond the Headlines. What happens after the war is an open question, and I think there's another segment of this show that needs to devote itself to that question.
I'll never get off this program. I'll be coming back all the time.
Well,
that's fine.
There are some very lucky students at Interlochen Arts Academy, at NMC, and at Ferris State who get a chance to go in more depth with Brian McCall, and we certainly appreciate his being here on Beyond the Headlines. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Jack.